manage his children and his household well. Those, verse 13, and I want you to notice this verse especially, who have served well, gain an excellent standing and great assurance in their faith in Christ Jesus. A deacon, ultimately, is a servant. And this list is a description of the kind of character and traits of one who serves well. But it cannot be said simply about a person. It has to be said about what that person believes and then does in response to those beliefs. It has to be faith that is put into action. Service. We've talked about one of the biblical images of service is this idea of an under-rower. A person who would sit down below the level of the deck and would strive to get the ship to the place that it's supposed to go. Serving from below. It's a wonderful image about service. But I'd like to propose that we add another word to service. Now, you're probably thinking I'm going to say leadership, right? Servant leadership, that's what we usually say. That's the phrase we throw out when we talk about deacons. But I'd like to have another word that begins with S-E. Look with me in Philippians chapter 2, verse 25. Now, if we were to go back to the very first verse of the book of Philippians, you would see that Paul says, together with the deacons and overseers, that there is a sense in which Paul is addressing the deacons. Now, I can't prove to you that Epaphroditus was a deacon in this church. Maybe he was an overseer. I don't know. But there is an important word that describes something about Epaphroditus. Look at verse 25, if you will. I think it is necessary to send back to you Epaphroditus, my brother, co-worker, and fellow soldier, who is also your messenger, whom you sent to take care of my needs. That's the word I want to propose as the second word about what it means to be a deacon. To be a deacon is to be sent. To be sent. Now, God send us to serve in specific ways. You know, many people would suggest to us that the first instance that you have of deacons is in the book of Acts, where you have this dilemma in the church because in this distribution of food that was taking place, because this difficulty had set in, these widows who were receiving food, some of them were getting overlooked. And they were getting overlooked because they spoke Greek. And they had Greek names. They were from outside of Jerusalem. Now, they're still Jews, but they're kind of outsiders. You know what I mean, right? It's like you're not from here. Wisconsin. Did I say it right? You are not from here. Now you're welcome here. I want you to say y'all before you leave, but you're welcome here. But there's sometimes when things get difficult, the people start to get set aside, and it's usually those ones that aren't from here. They're not one of us. And this group of widows was starting to get overlooked, and so they began to complain. And the apostles, they had this dilemma. What are we going to do? How are we going to respond to this situation? And so they came up with this idea that they would have servants. It's kind of the first time you see that form of the word the deacon is derived from, used. They picked these men who would basically just serve and overlook the service of these widows. But they were sent by the church to serve. They were called to do that. And it's so important that we recognize how vital that is. Jesus says that obedience is the expression of love that he wants his disciples to demonstrate. This is how you know that you love, right? You obey. You do what I say. We kind of almost short-circuited this process to think that you just have to think the right things about Jesus. But there's a point where we must do the right things in response to Jesus. deacons are sent in that way to help us see what that service looks like. In that sense, they do lead. They demonstrate to us what it is to serve. So go back with me again to Philippians chapter 2, where he describes what has happened with Epaphroditus. Epaphroditus has been sent to assist Paul while he was in prison. Now, from what I understand about prison in those times, there was not a kind of human rights checklist that you had to have a certain nutritional, medical, sanitation standard. And so oftentimes those basic needs would go unmet. And so someone from the outside, apart from this system, would be required to come in and help. So the Philippians sent Epaphroditus to Paul for that reason. And yet, Epaphroditus was so much more than just there to attend to Paul. Paul says these three things about him. He says, you see that in verse 25? He calls him his brother, which speaks about their shared faith. That fellowship that exists because they have a common bond in Jesus. He calls him my co-worker. He's helping Paul by joining in the work that is going on in that place. And fellow soldier. What does that speak of? We would probably be tempted to think that the focus here is warfare, but I really think it's more about suffering. That he is enduring with Paul the difficulties, hardships, and costs that are required of one who would stand up for the gospel, who would participate in this calling. And notice what it says at the end of that verse. Whom you sent to take care of my needs. You know, we've already addressed that, verse 26. For he longs for all of you in his distress because you heard he was ill. He served in such a way that it was costly to him. And that's what we look at when we look at people who we set aside. It's not who do we get to ask to be a deacon, and then they'll start doing this. It's who is it that's already serving? Who is it that has already taken seriously this call to sacrifice, to give, to pour out on behalf of others, to be sent to serve? You, with me, have said, well, two of those guys are Paul and Jack. So I'm going to ask you all to come and sit, one here, one here, in these chairs. Aren't they dressed nice today? I'm impressed. I'm impressed. James, I'm trying to get them to wear a tie. They claim they don't. I don't know if that's illegal or not. But I've had the privilege of serving beside these guys for quite some time. We have served in a lot of capacities. And I recognize them as deacons. I recognize them as men of integrity, with a deep commitment to Christ, who are sent, who we set apart today to help our church continue in the direction that God has called. So, Chad, Paul, we are deeply grateful for the two of you. We love you and are overwhelmed with joy to be able to see what God has done in your lives. We're also recipients of the work that you've done. But I tell you, as a pastor, to have young men come in and say, how can I help? What needs to be done? And then begin to say, here's what we need to do. And then here's what God's calling me to do. And to step out and to lead in that way. is tremendous. You are more precious to me than you know. And I count you my brothers. I'm going to ask our deacons if they would come and stand behind them, James and Mingo. James and Mingo are really excited because they're thinking about how much help they're getting. It's a great privilege. But they're going to come, and I've asked James if he would lead us in a prayer. And this is our way of the church is saying to these men, we recognize that you've been sent to serve, and we set you apart for the ministry of the ordained. And we signify that today by the laying on of hands.
Our Heavenly Father, we're so thankful for this opportunity we have to participate in this ordination service. We're so thankful, dear God, for all care in their lives and the opportunity that they have to take their position and continue to serve you. We're thankful, dear God, for their families and for the way that they work and participate in all avenues of our church. We're just thankful again, dear God, for this an opportunity to participate in, for the opportunity to receive service and our leadership. We send that as in precious name. This time, Jeff Hall, you don't have the church would like to give y'all this little plaque as a reminder of this event, and it will mean a lot to you. Just keep that, and we are just showing a little appreciation for you. We'll never forget this part right here now. This will always mean a lot to you. Okay, we're certainly glad to have these two young Christian men and their families to join us and serve here and to serve God and to be the type of leaders that they should be for the coming years. And I know this will mean a lot. And as we close out, we'd like to invite each one of you to come down and congratulate our two new deacons and let them show them a little word of encouragement, because they do mean a lot to us, and I think we will all have a great deal of service together. So at this time, if y'all would I'm going to ask Mingo, if he will, to close us out in prayer. And then if you would come by and give them a little Christian hand of touch. Thank you.
Father, thank you, Lord, for this day. Thank you for Chad. Thank you for Paul. I thank you, Father God, for the work that you have. Thank you for the serve you. So just pray that you will continue to